Beneath the surface of human history lie fragments of forgotten worlds, traces of civilizations whose knowledge and rituals have disappeared through time. These mysteries defy simple explanations. Stone circles, disappeared peoples, symbols that seem to be written in the language of another era. Each riddle is a window into the past, a hint of lost meanings waiting to be deciphered. The mystery of the Sarong stone circles. In the depths of the humid tropical lands of Sarong, where thick fog still obscures the outlines of the hills, there are stone circles that have long remained one of the most mysterious mysteries of antiquity. They stretch in a chain through forest clearings, sometimes appearing on barely visible hills. Local residents consider them to be the remains of forgotten peoples who lived long before the appearance of known cultures in the region. Researchers note the remarkable preservation of the structures. The stones are practically undamaged, as if they were protected by the environment itself. The first descriptions of these circles mentioned smooth lines between the stone blocks, which seemed unusual in an area where the humid climate quickly erases any traces of careful carving. Each circle is made up of large vertical slabs set so deeply into the ground that attempts to determine their original height are imprecise. Geologists emphasize that the stone blocks themselves are taken from rock that is not found in the immediate vicinity. This means that ancient builders moved massive slabs over significant distances using methods that left no traces. Searchers of ancient roads have tried to discover traces of trails or traces of dragging, but the soil of the sarong remains silent. All that remains are the stones themselves, as if left intentionally as a message for future generations. The location of the circles deserves special attention. Some researchers believe that they form a single line, slightly offset relative to the ancient starises. Comparisons with celestial maps revealed coincidences that are difficult to attribute to chance. However, due to the lack of written sources, it is impossible to say with certainty whether the creators of the circles observed the sky or used these coordinates as part of a ritual plan. Archaeoastronomers emphasize that such coincidences are not unique to this place. Many ancient structures around the world are oriented to celestial bodies. However, sarong stones are unique in that their precision exceeds what would be expected from a culture we know nothing about. Upon closer inspection, the stone surfaces are covered in microscopic lines. They do not look like inscriptions or symbols, but rather like traces of work with an unknown tool. The stones look polished, but their natural relief is preserved. This gives the impression that the craftsmen sought to preserve the natural shape by removing only a thin surface layer. Experts in ancient technology have tried to reproduce this technique using stone and wooden tools, but the results are significantly inferior to the examples from the sarong. This raises the question, did the builders have knowledge that we do not see in other monuments in the region? The internal structure of these circles is also controversial. Some researchers believe that they served as ceremonial places where rituals related to the observation of natural cycles were performed. Others believe that these were points where ancient inhabitants recorded seasonal transitions, allowing them to better manage their agriculture. The problem is that there is nothing inside the circles that could provide a direct explanation. No traces of fires, no remains of pottery, no funeral rituals. The entire space is perfectly clean, as if it had been carefully cleaned or had never been used for domestic purposes. Legends about sarongs tell of a people who came from afar and disappeared, leaving behind only stones as a reminder of their wanderings. According to these legends, the circles are the anchors of their spirit, allowing them to connect with the world of the stars. Scientists consider such stories to be cultural heritage, but recognize that sometimes legends contain a grain of truth about real events. Perhaps these circles were indeed part of a ritual practice based on observation of the sky, which is reflected in their orientation. One of the boldest hypotheses connects these circles with a system of knowledge transfer. Unusual resonance effects have been discovered in some structures. The sound emitted in the center of the circle intensifies and changes color. The researchers suggest that the builders knew the properties of these stones and created acoustic zones where the sound was transformed into a special vibration phenomenon. In ancient cultures, vibrations were often associated with meditative practices or entering an altered state of consciousness. However, there is no direct evidence of such a function. There are only observations of physical effects. In some places, the soil around the circles has a different chemical composition. Some suggest that special plants used in rituals grew there. However, this remains only an assumption. The climate was constantly changing, and it is impossible to determine exactly what plants existed at that time. However, the unusual soil patterns reinforce the impression that the circles were part of a complex system linking rock, earth, sky, and people. Despite numerous studies, there is still no definitive explanation for the origin of these structures. The sarong stone circles remain an open book, each page written not with ink, but with the shadow of the past. They combine precision, mystery, and apparent simplicity that hides deep meaning. The more scientists learn about them, the more questions arise. Perhaps their purpose was multifaceted, sacred, astronomical, and social at the same time. So the stone circles continue to stand in the green fog of the sarong, as if watching us and waiting for the moment when we learn to ask the right questions. In the end, the true mysteries of antiquity are revealed not to those who seek answers, but to those who know how to listen. Undeciphered symbols of Sujama. High on the rugged rocky cliffs of Sujam, where the winds cut the air like invisible knives, lie mysterious symbols that have become one of the most mysterious mysteries of the ancient world. They are depicted on steep walls, inaccessible without special equipment. When the first explorers saw these symbols, they were struck not only by their location, but also by the strange repetition of patterns. The symbols appear to be carved into stone with incredible precision, and their creators seem to have sought to preserve some important knowledge that only they could understand. The surface of the stone slabs with symbols is smooth, as if specially prepared. This is no ordinary stone foundation, damaged by wind and rain. The stone appears to have been cleaned and polished with great difficulty. Experts suggest that ancient craftsmen knew processing techniques that allowed them to smooth the surface without causing serious damage to the structure. However, such work would require significant effort and time, as well as a clear understanding of the final goal. The very placement of the symbols demonstrates that their creators were willing to go to great heights to place the message where only the initiated could see it. The structure of the symbols resembles writing, but does not correspond to any known system. Researchers have discovered about 30 basic signs, repeated in various combinations. Sometimes they form rows, sometimes they are arranged in a circle or in vertical columns. Moreover, each sign has its own unique shape, as if created using a template. Some believe that this is an early form of sacred writing of the people who lived in the Sujama valleys. However, archaeological finds do not confirm the existence of a developed written culture in these areas. This suggests that the symbols may have belonged to an earlier extinct society. Attempts to decipher these symbols have been ongoing for many years. Experts in ancient languages compared the signs with the writing of neighboring regions, but did not find convincing matches. Other researchers have tried to link the symbols to natural phenomena, believing that they represent patterns in the movements of stars or a record of seasonal cycles. However, the strict geometry of the signs makes such connections too strained. Each combination seems deliberate, but the underlying meaning eludes them, as if the symbols were deliberately created to confuse the observer. The technique used to engrave the symbols is particularly puzzling. The stone on which the symbols were carved has an unusual texture, as if it had been burned rather than carved or scratched by some unknown means. Some surfaces have a slight shine, reminiscent of heat marks. Mineralogists believe that exposure to high temperatures could change the properties of the stone. But how the ancients managed to create local heating in hard-to-reach places remains an unanswered question. Local legends tell of a people who knew how to process stone so that it became soft like clay. According to legend, these masters used a secret known only to the priests. According to local residents, the marks on the stones are their rituals, preserved forever. Although legends cannot be considered accurate accounts of events, they often contain elements that point to forgotten practices. Perhaps the ancients did know ways to temporarily change the properties of stone, even if modern scientists cannot explain such technology. Interestingly, the Sujam symbols are not located randomly, but form a network covering several rocks. When viewed from above, the symbols appear as invisible lines intersecting at certain angles. This has led some researchers to speculate that the symbols served as landmarks or markers for navigating rough terrain. But why then are they located so high, where the path is dangerous, even for experienced climbers? Several years ago, a detailed study of the shape and depth of the lines was carried out. It was discovered that each indentation had the same depth, which is impossible with normal hand carving. This led to the hypothesis of the existence of a tool that could create signs with mathematical precision. However, not a single such instrument was found among archaeological finds. It is noteworthy that there are no traces of even the slightest correction. It seems as if each sign was executed perfectly the first time. Some researchers believe that symbols perform energetic rather than semantic functions. This idea sounds unusual, but in some places near these signs there has been a slight change in the magnetic field. Scientists explain this by the natural properties of rocks, but the coincidence with the location of the symbols is questionable. Perhaps the ancients knew more about the properties of stone than we think, and used them to create places that had a certain influence on people. Despite many years of attempts to understand them, the symbols of Sujam remain silent witnesses of time. Their lines continue to attract the attention of those seeking clues to forgotten languages. They seem to promise to reveal their secret, but each time they mislead the researcher by offering new ideas. Perhaps a different approach is needed to understand them, one that does not rely solely on logic and comparison, but takes into account the connection between man and nature that once underpinned ancient cultures. Thus, the symbols of Sujam continue to hang on the steep walls, as if carved by the hands of those who wanted to appeal to future generations. They remind us that not all knowledge can be measured or graphed. Some secrets remain hidden not because we cannot read, but because the time has not yet come to hear their voice. Underground passages of Nakbe. Under the dense thickets of the ancient Nakbe, hidden in the silence of the tropical forest, lies a network of underground passages that remain one of the most complex architectural mysteries of antiquity. When archaeologists first explored these lands, they discovered not just caves or natural cracks, but carefully carved passages going to significant depths. Their structure resembles a huge labyrinth, where each gallery leads to a new fork. The ancient builders apparently had an amazing understanding of the behavior of soils, since the walls of these passages rarely collapse, despite the humid climate of the region. The walls of most galleries are made of carefully fitted stones. They don't form perfectly straight lines, but their geometry seems intentional. The stones are arranged to distribute the load and support the arch, as if the builders intuitively understood the principles of balance. Some researchers believe that the builders used a method based on observations of natural caves. Perhaps they imitated forms created by nature over the centuries. This explains why the vaults remain intact even after long periods of flooding, typical of these areas during the monsoons. Particularly interesting are the areas where the corridors branch into several levels. Such elevation changes seem too complex to be random. In some places, the ceilings are designed in such a way that the sound reflected from the stone creates a subtle echo that lasts an unusually long time. Experts suggest that the ancients could have used similar acoustic effects in rituals. In confined spaces, sound acquires a special depth, and its impact on a person is enhanced. Perhaps the passages of the Nakba served not only as a means of transportation, but also as sacred places where rituals were performed that required isolation from the outside world. Despite their complexity, virtually no traces of permanent human habitation have been found inside these passages. There are no pottery vessels, remains of hearths, or household items. This supports the idea that the passages served ritual or engineering purposes rather than domestic ones. It is believed that they connected different parts of the ancient settlement, allowing priests and nobles to move around undetected. However, no one can explain why such a large network was created in such harsh soil conditions. Humidity and lack of ventilation make the corridors difficult to use on a regular basis. Interestingly, the Nakbe passages in some places lead to underground chambers that seem to expand in only one direction, forming unusual oval spaces. Their shape resembles elongated chambers where small groups of people could gather. On the walls of these halls, traces of processing are visible, and sometimes even almost invisible notches. They do not look like pictograms or symbols, but rather the marks of a tool used to smooth the surface. Perhaps these halls were used to create a special atmosphere associated with darkness and echo, immersing people in a state necessary for rituals. Some researchers suggest that underground passages served as a means of storing and distributing water. The region often experiences periods of intense rainfall followed by dry seasons. In such circumstances, water management would be vital. It is believed that the corridors acted as channels, collecting moisture and channeling it into central reservoirs. However, direct evidence of the existence of a hydraulic system has not yet been found, and the shape of the passages more closely resembles a space for movement than a reservoir. One of the most puzzling features of Nakbe is the absence of major landslides. Even sites built on loose rock remain stable. This demonstrates a deep understanding of local conditions. Perhaps the builders used a method of laying stones that allowed them to stabilize the walls without the use of binders. This method is known in various ancient cultures, but in the Nakba, it is especially masterfully performed. The stones seem to breathe along with the soil, adapting to its changes. Observations show that some passages are oriented relative to the main directions. This gives rise to speculation about their connection with astronomical cycles. If the ancients actually built this network with such landmarks in mind, it could serve as a kind of map or model of the world as they understood it. For many cultures, underground space symbolized the path to truths hidden from everyday view. Perhaps the passages of the Nakbe represented a material embodiment of this idea, creating a space where people felt disconnected from everyday life. There is also a theory that these passages could be used for initiation. Young members of the community, entering the path of initiation, passed through underground darkness, encountering silence and the unknown. This experience may have strengthened their sense of unity with the tribe and its traditions. The underworld was often seen as a place where people communicated with the spirits of their ancestors. Therefore, these passages could be part of a whole system of rituals that strengthen the connection between generations. Despite attempts to explain the origin and purpose of these passages, they remain a mystery. Each researcher sees in them his own interpretation, an engineering solution, a religious space, a hidden network of passages, or even an element of ancient mythology embodied in stone. But no one can say with certainty which version is closer to the truth. The underground passages of the Nakbe live their own life, hidden from light and time, as if preserving in stone the breath of those who walked along them in ancient times. Thus, this network continues to penetrate deep into the earth, inviting those who are willing to listen to its silence. Perhaps one day, her secret will be revealed. But like many mysteries of the past, the Nakbe reminds us that the path to understanding always begins with respect for those who built the world differently than we do. Stone platforms of Pamela. In the high hills of Palmela, where the sea breeze rises up the rocky slopes and mingles with the scent of the warm earth, lie mysterious platforms that have sparked controversy for decades. Their massive outlines are hidden under layers of vegetation, but where the undergrowth recedes, smooth stone surfaces are revealed, reminiscent of huge terraces. Apparently, these platforms served as foundations for structures, but no traces of buildings were found on them. Everything indicates that the platforms were conceived as independent structures with an important but still unexplained purpose. Each platform consists of large blocks that fit perfectly together. There are no traces of glue, and everything holds together thanks to the precision of installation. The blocks have different shapes, but at the junction they form a barely noticeable line. This craftsmanship is amazing, as local stone is difficult to polish. Some geologists believe that ancient craftsmen used a method of gradually heating and cooling the stone to achieve smooth surfaces. This method requires precise knowledge of mineral behavior, demonstrating a high level of craftsmanship rarely seen in the region's ancient structures. Thin lines are visible on the surface of the platforms, as if left by a tool or device sliding along the stone. However, these marks do not appear to be damage or scratches. They are too straight, too uniform, as if they served as landmarks or markers. The researchers note that some lines converge at similar angles on different platforms, suggesting that they are combined into a single system. Perhaps the ancient builders used these landmarks for astronomical observations, aligning points through which sunlight or moonlight passed. However, there is no direct evidence of such a purpose yet. Interestingly, the platforms are located at different heights, forming a sequence of rises. From below, they look like steps leading to the top of the hill. This form is reminiscent of cult complexes known to various ancient peoples, where ascent symbolized the transition from the world of people to the world of spirits. But in Palmela, there are no carved stones, altars, or images indicating a religious purpose. Here, only empty, austere surfaces await their lost meaning. Some scientists believe the platforms could have been used to monitor the sea. Their peaks offer views of the coastline, and on a clear day you can make out the horizon. Perhaps the ancient builders created a system of observation posts to monitor the movement of ships. But this raises the question, why were such massive and labor-intensive structures needed? Simple stone platforms or mounds could serve the same function. However, Palmela's platforms are distinguished by their scale and complexity, as if they served a purpose much greater than mere observation. It has been suggested that the platforms were part of a larger engineering complex, designed to collect rainwater. Their flat surfaces could direct water into specially created depressions or reservoirs. The region is often prone to drought, and this method of storing water may have been an important element in the existence of ancient settlements. However, no channels or traces of drainage structures were found around the platforms. Moreover, the platforms themselves are too free of the sediments typical of such systems. This makes the water harvesting hypothesis interesting but unfounded. The largest platform, located at the top of the hill, creates a special feeling. Its surface is so smooth that it seems artificially polished. In certain lighting, the stone reflects light, creating a subtle shine. Some researchers wonder whether this feature was used in rituals requiring the presence of light. Perhaps the surface served as a kind of mirror, enhancing the sun's rays. But why is the platform so large if such a function could be performed by a small area? The archives contain testimonies from travelers who met local residents who, until recently, avoided climbing these stone platforms. They considered them to be places belonging to their ancestors and claimed to hear footsteps there even when no one was there. Such legends often accompany ancient structures, especially if their purpose remains unclear. And although the scientific explanation for such stories is related to the acoustic effects arising from the shape of the hill, the mysterious attitude of local residents towards the sites adds to their mystery. Observations show that at certain points on the platforms, the sound does indeed behave unusually. The rustling intensifies and the footsteps create a louder echo than one would expect from an open space. Perhaps the stones are positioned in such a way as to create specific resonant zones that amplify sounds. This raises parallels with ancient religious buildings in other regions where acoustics played an important role in rituals. However, there is not a single element in Palmela that directly confirms the presence of rituals. Everything remains at the level of assumptions and comparisons. Particularly interesting is the corner hidden along the edges of the platforms. These are small niches carved into stone. Their origin is unknown. They are too small to hold objects and too neat to be the remains of natural erosion. Some suggest that they may have had wooden posts supporting lightweight structures. In this case, the platforms could serve as the foundation of long-vanished buildings. But if this is so, why did these structures leave no traces, despite the fact that the surrounding stone was perfectly preserved? Another hypothesis links the platforms to an ancient measurement system. Perhaps they served as huge platforms for creating maps, drawing lines, or performing calculations related to the movement of celestial bodies. Lines on the surface may be part of such a system. However, this theory requires the assumption that the inhabitants of Palmela had knowledge superior to that of their neighbors, and there is no archaeological evidence for this. However, researchers continue to find traces of strict geometry in the arrangement of the platforms, as if each were part of a single plan. Despite decades of scientific research, the mystery of the Palmela stone platforms remains unsolved. Their shapes, placement, workmanship, and strange acoustic properties create a picture in which each element has a meaning, but none explains the whole. It is possible that these structures were part of a sacred complex that did not require walls, statues, or altars. Perhaps these were places of power where ancient people observed the world, connecting with nature through stone and light. Or perhaps they were engineering platforms created for unknown practical purposes. Today, platforms rising from the hills, faded but majestic, watch as the world and its people change. They are silent, but this silence is filled with meaning. It seems as if every crack and line on the surface is part of an unsolved message. And although Palmela remains hidden, it remains one of those rare places where antiquity breathes so close, as if the distance between eras disappears. The mystery of the Ecbatana tunnels. Beneath ancient Ecbatana, a city shrouded in legends of treasures and the secrets they hold for centuries, lies a network of tunnels built with such precision and majesty that researchers still debate the capabilities of the builders. The tunnels go to considerable depths, sometimes forming multi-level intersections that resemble the structure of a giant hidden city. They do not look like typical underground passages, nor like shelters, nor like secret passages characteristic of many ancient settlements. The Ecbatana tunnels are something much larger and more complex. The first thing that strikes you about these underground passages is the quality of their construction. The walls of many tunnels are lined with stone blocks, so tightly fitted to each other that it is impossible to insert even a thin object between them. The blocks have different shapes, but their seams form amazingly straight lines, as if craftsmen used complex tools to align them. Some stones show traces of processing, reminiscent of small depressions that could serve as attachment points during installation. But the strangest thing is that such traces were found in the most inaccessible places, where work would be extremely difficult. The height of the tunnel ceilings varies depending on their purpose. Some are narrow passages that can only be walked in a crouched position, while others are huge vaults that lead into darkness and create the feeling of a hidden space intended for meetings or other events involving large numbers of people. Researchers analyzing the shape of these vaults noted that they were built on the principle of uniform load distribution, preventing collapse. This suggests that the builders had a deep understanding of the properties of stone and soil, although such knowledge was not officially recorded at the time. The system of side niches located along the walls of some galleries deserves special attention. These niches are the same size and ideal shape. According to one theory, they could have housed oil lamps to illuminate the path. However, no traces of soot were found on the stones, which refutes this idea. Another possible theory suggests that the niches were used to store small objects associated with rituals. However, the lack of finds forces us to reconsider this assumption. Each niche remains empty, as if the ancient inhabitants had deliberately removed everything that might explain their purpose. Researchers are also amazed by the acoustics of the tunnels. In some places, the sound is amplified, as if the walls were specially built to direct it to a specific point. In other places, the sound fades so quickly that it seems to be absorbed into space. These features could be part of a complex signaling system or serve as an element of rituals performed underground. Ancient cultures often used underground spaces to connect with the world of their ancestors, and Ecbatana may have continued this tradition, creating the conditions for experiences not available on the surface. Despite the vastness of the network, virtually no traces of everyday life were found in the tunnels. No remains of pottery, no traces of fires, no tools. This indicates that the tunnels were not used as shelters or dwellings. In addition, there are no signs of mass movement of people, which makes their function even more mysterious. Some believe that the underground network was intended for the movement of priests or members of the nobility who could move between parts of the city without being noticed. However, this theory does not explain the huge halls and the complexity of the entire structure. According to legend, the Ecbatana tunnels were built to protect the vast wealth hidden in the heart of the city. According to legend, kings hid their treasures in underground chambers, to which a labyrinth of corridors led. But archaeologists have found no evidence of such treasures. Moreover, the structure of the tunnels itself is too complex for a simple security system. If the goal was simply to hide valuables, a few secret chambers would be enough, rather than a multi-level network resembling an entire underground civilization. Some researchers suggest that the tunnels were connected to the water supply system. Underground canals in ancient cities often served to drain rainwater or store supplies. However, at Ecbatana, there are no traces of moisture or stone structures that could hold water. In addition, the tunnels themselves are too straight and dry, and their vaults are too high to be part of a water supply system. This makes the hypothesis of the presence of water unlikely, although it cannot be completely ruled out. Interestingly, many of the tunnels coincide with the location of ancient temples on the surface of the earth. This suggests that underground routes may have connected sacred sites in the city, creating a hidden network that replicated the structure of sacred roads on the surface. In this case, the tunnels could serve as places for secret rituals, accessible only to initiates. The passage from one temple to another, through the darkness of underground chambers, could symbolize the journey of the soul between worlds. This also explains the unique acoustics. Rituals performed in such conditions would enhance their emotional impact. No less mysterious is the question of how the builders made their way underground. The tunnels intersect in such a way that an error in the calculations could lead to the collapse of the vaults, but no such errors were found. Each gallery is designed with great precision, as if the builders had knowledge of geology and construction that surpasses that of known technology. This raises the question of the existence of ancient traditions that were transmitted orally and were not preserved in written sources. Despite extensive research, the tunnels of Ecbatana continue to excite with their mystery. It seems that every new meter explored raises more questions than answers. They do not look like defensive structures, are not an engineering system, do not serve as storage facilities, and do not leave obvious traces of rituals. And yet they exist, and with obvious intent. Ecbatana seemed to hide another world beneath it, into which only those who knew the way could enter. And today, when explorers descend into these dark passages, they feel the same silence that the ancient priests heard. Silence filled with anticipation. Perhaps the tunnels were created by those who wanted to hide not treasures, but knowledge. And if this is so, then their secret lies not in the question of purpose, but in the question of what truths were so important that they could only be conveyed in stone and darkness. The Lost Archives of Byblos. The city of Byblos, located on the shores of an ancient sea and once a key center of trade and knowledge, has always been shrouded in legends about the great scrolls that preserved the memory of the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. These legendary archives are mentioned in later texts, which speak of rooms filled with documents, tablets, ritual records, and records of rulers. But no one has ever seen the archives themselves. All that remained of them was a shadow. Tiny references, seemingly scattered across different eras, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase the memory of what they contained. When archaeologists first began excavating the area of ancient Byblos, they hoped to find traces of the extensive written tradition spoken of in legend. In ancient times, the city was an important center connecting traders, priests, and rulers from different countries. Sea routes constantly crossed here, and the exchange of knowledge was as important as the exchange of goods. It was assumed that in such a place there should have been repositories where events, laws, and legends were recorded. However, during the initial stages of the search, no archives were found. However, in some excavated rooms, archaeologists found traces indicating the existence of a written tradition, charred pieces of thin bark, and fragments of clay seals. This suggests that the archives may have existed but disappeared for some unknown reason. Ancient fires in the city may have destroyed fragile materials. But oddly enough, none of the surviving premises looked like specially equipped storage. Even where the remains of seals were found, the walls showed no signs of shelves or niches typical of ancient libraries. However, written evidence about Byblos indicates that the city was famous for its school of priests, who wrote down rituals and spells on special tablets. These tablets, according to legend, were passed down from generation to generation. One ancient author claimed that Byblos preserved knowledge of lands whose peoples had long since disappeared. However, if such records ever existed, they are now hidden or destroyed. Some researchers suggest that the archives could be stored in separate underground chambers that have not yet been discovered. The city is located on a hill that may hide entire levels of ancient structures. Particularly intriguing is the story of the priests, who, according to their ancestors, knew how to create secret repositories protected from destruction. These premises could be located under temples, where unauthorized access was prohibited. However, even carefully examined temples did not find any traces of such chambers. The hypothesis remains that the entrances to the underground archives could be in places destroyed or buried over the centuries. In some places, archaeologists have discovered underground voids, but their exploration is difficult due to the risk of collapse. Another aspect often found in the legends of Byblos is the mention of a book of times supposedly kept in the city. According to legend, it recorded the cycles of eras and natural phenomena. Some believe that this book could be part of the archive. Although such stories are often perceived as symbolic, they indicate that the inhabitants of Byblos were involved in processes that went far beyond the ordinary life of the city. Perhaps the archive did contain more than just economic records or ritual notes. No less mysterious is the fact that references to biblical texts are found in various Mediterranean cultures. This indicates the widespread influence of the archive, but does not explain why not a single fragment of it survives. Researchers are discussing the possibility that the archive was removed from the city during one of its many conquests. Such cases are not uncommon in history. The victors took away important documents as symbols of power. But where could such vast collections have disappeared to? No collections corresponding to the scale described were found in any of the known centers of the region. Of particular interest is a stone slab found near the temple, which is engraved with the image of a man holding a scroll. This could be a symbol of priestly power, but also indicates a tradition of working with texts. There are small indentations around the figure on the slab, perhaps indicating the number of sections or levels of storage. However, this figure is open to different interpretations, and researchers are hesitant to draw definitive conclusions. Some have put forward the bold hypothesis that the archives may not have been located in one place, but were a network of smaller repositories. Each such repository could contain a piece of information, ritual texts, trade records, ancient legends. In this case, it would be almost impossible to discover them all since time could destroy some of them, and others could be hidden under new layers of buildings. In addition, the ancient inhabitants of Byblos may have deliberately hidden some texts, considering them sacred or dangerous for the uninitiated. Of particular note is the theory that the archives were created using materials that do not stand the test of time. If the texts were written on bark or thin cloth, they might disappear completely. However, why wouldn't the priests of such an important city write their texts on more durable materials? This suggests that archives served not only a practical, but also a ritual purpose, and the recorded material could have a sacred meaning, for example, being considered alive or symbolically associated with nature. Despite the disappointment of the search, the very idea of lost archives makes Byblos one of the most mysterious cities of antiquity. He seems to be keeping a secret that no one should know. If the archives were destroyed, it may have been done deliberately to hide knowledge that could change our understanding of history. If they are hidden, perhaps they are waiting for someone who can decipher the signs left unintentionally. Thus, the legend of the lost archives lives on, as if the city itself whispers that the truth exists, but is hidden deeper than we can imagine. Stone walls of Carhenge. On the deserted hills of Carhenge, where the wind glides unimpeded across the dry earth, leaving winding traces on the slopes, there are stone walls whose antiquity is palpable even without precise measurements. Their extent is amazing. Sometimes they rise to the tops of the hills, sometimes they disappear into the lowlands, as if following a plan understandable only to their creators. They are built from massive stone blocks, crafted with amazing precision. Each block fits so tightly against the next that it appears as if the stones were once soft and then hardened into a perfect alignment. The builder's ability to achieve such precision remains a mystery, raising new questions with every investigation. The walls form a complex network stretching for many kilometers. Moreover, they do not form closed structures, as one would expect from defensive structures. Instead, the walls seem to meander across the landscape, sometimes branching, sometimes converging at narrow points. This structural behavior is reminiscent of ancient sacred lines connecting points of power. However, not a single sanctuary or significant object was found near the walls. This makes their purpose especially unclear. Some researchers believe that the walls served as territorial boundaries, others that they were symbols of power. But all these assumptions are refuted by the incredible labor put into their construction. The stones used to build the walls were quarried from various places. Geologists discovered that some of the blocks were taken from nearby rocks, but a significant portion came from distant hills. This suggests that the ancient inhabitants of Carhenge transported heavy boulders over considerable distances, leaving no traces of roads or other means of transportation. In some places, the walls are on steep slopes, making lifting such massive stones extremely difficult. This indicates the existence of technological methods that were not preserved among neighboring peoples. The builders may have used wooden structures, but no trace remains of them. The seams between the stones deserve special attention. In some places, the blocks are fitted in such a way that the impression of a puzzle is created. The stones seem to fit together perfectly, forming a stable structure that can withstand strong earthquakes. The researchers note that these joints are similar to a technique in which stone elements are cut into each other, preventing walls from delaminating. However, most of these techniques date back to later periods and are found in other regions. The appearance of this method in Carhenge evokes a strong desire to understand the depth of knowledge of local craftsmen. Interestingly, the height of the walls varies. In some places, they reach the height of a man, while in others, they barely rise above the ground. This contradicts the idea of defensive goals. Defense here is clearly insufficient. Moreover, Walls often lack internal logic. They can collapse suddenly or change direction abruptly. Such variability seems strange for a structure designed to perform a specific practical function. Some researchers suggest that the walls were part of a terracing program aimed at retaining soil. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that the walls are located too far apart and do not have a reinforced foundation or sloping surfaces characteristic of terraces. Another theory suggests that the walls of Carhenge served as symbolic landmarks. Some areas actually align with the sunrise direction at certain times of the year. But such coincidences, although interesting, are too rare to draw a clear conclusion. If the walls were part of an astronomical system, it would seem much more logical. However, their chaotic nature precludes such an interpretation. However, it is possible that the meaning of orientation was lost due to destruction, or the lack of objects that could complement the image of the sky on the ground. Sometimes subtle lines appear on the surface of the stones. They do not look like inscriptions or images, but rather like traces of tools used to process the surface. However, some of the lines have a strange orientation, as if they were drawn after the blocks were installed. This suggests a reuse of the walls. Perhaps later inhabitants left their marks on the ancient structures in an attempt to understand their meaning. However, the lines are too thin and located in hard-to-reach places, making this theory dubious. The section of the wall passing through the gorge poses a special mystery. The stones there form a semicircular shape, reminiscent of an amphitheater. The center of this shape exhibits an unusual acoustic feature. A whisper in the center is heard significantly louder than a loud voice nearby. This phenomenon has been studied by experts, and most consider it a coincidence. However, too many coincidences indicate that the builders may have taken into account the acoustic features of this place. This section of the wall could have been used for rituals related to sound. Although there is no direct evidence, the feeling of the presence of an ancient tradition in these places haunts researchers. Despite the scale of the structures, no significant settlements around the walls have yet been discovered. There were small camps, but they clearly could not support such large-scale construction. This suggests that the builders came from outside or formed large communities only for the duration of construction. This practice is well known among ancient peoples, when the construction of sacred structures became a gathering place for people. But why, after construction was completed, did the walls turn out to be so isolated and devoid of traces of permanent habitation? Some believe that the walls of Carhenge served as landmarks along the ancient route. Perhaps they showed the way through the vast expanses, helping travelers navigate the plains. But this also raises questions. The walls are too complex to serve as simple landmarks, and their unevenness makes them of little use. However, if the walls were part of a sacred road, the logic changes. Sacred paths rarely follow a straight line. They reflect myths, cycles, and travel routes known to initiates but hidden from others. Today, the walls of Carhenge stand exposed to the winds, like the remains of a world that has lost its original form. They seem to feel the gaze of everyone who approaches them and respond only with silence. Their secret lies not in their shape, size, or technique, but in their continued existence as part of lost knowledge. Perhaps they were part of a huge structure, fragments of which we see only today. Perhaps these were symbols that had lost their context, or maybe the walls themselves are a message that we have not yet learned to decipher. Unsolved bas-reliefs of Mitla. In the stone halls of ancient Mitla, where the air seems to be filled with centuries-old silence, there are mysterious bas-reliefs that amaze with the precision of the lines and the complexity of the hidden patterns. Their surfaces are covered with intertwining geometric motifs that defy easy interpretation. Each element of these patterns seems to be connected to the others, forming a single language, the meaning of which eludes modern researchers. Bas-reliefs decorate the walls of halls, corridors, and small sanctuaries, giving the impression that the very walls of Mitla can speak. The first thing that catches your eye in these bas-reliefs is the unusual technique of execution. They create a feeling of incredible depth, although, in fact, they are only carved into the stone surface by a few millimeters. The craftsmen who created them skillfully created the illusion of volume, using the subtlest interaction of light and shadow. The lines are as precise as if they were drawn with a tool capable of maintaining uniform depth across the entire surface. However, analysis shows that ancient craftsmen used simple stone and bone tools. This makes the patterns even more mysterious, as if they were created using a technique that was lost or hidden from subsequent generations. What is especially intriguing is that each hall in Mitla has its own unique pattern. In one room, lines form complex triangular patterns. In another, there are repeating waves. And in a third, there are motifs reminiscent of intertwined roads. This variety suggests that the bas-reliefs were part of a larger system of symbols, perhaps conveying knowledge about the world, time, or the cycles of nature. Some researchers believe that the patterns represented a map, but an unknown type of map that did not reflect the landscapes of the surrounding Mitla. If it really was a map, it might reflect the concept of a spiritual or cosmic order rather than physical landscapes. No less mysterious is the absence of images of people or gods, characteristic of many cultures in the region. There are no scenes of battles, hunting, or rituals in Mitla. Instead, it presents complex geometric systems without a direct narrative. This leads researchers to believe that the Mitla symbols were not intended for the general public, but were part of a closed tradition, accessible only to a narrow circle of initiates. Perhaps the priests used these walls as a kind of book, where every line and every angle had a meaning known only to those who could read the language. However, if it was a language, it was completely different from the known writing systems of the region. Comparisons with other texts did not yield any results. The bas-reliefs are too abstract, their lines too complex to clearly define their purpose. Some scientists tried to correlate the patterns with the movement of celestial bodies, believing that geometric shapes could reflect astronomical phenomena. But no calculations gave an exact match. Most likely, the bas-reliefs are indeed associated with cyclical processes, but these cycles are ritual or philosophical, and not physical in nature. The central hall is particularly impressive with its continuous pattern extending from floor to ceiling. It seems as if the craftsman cut it out in one movement, creating a smooth line flowing from one plane to another. Some researchers have noted unusual acoustics in the center of the hall. Whispers intensify, while loud voices, on the contrary, break up into separate sounds. This gives the impression that the hall was intended for rituals related to sound. Perhaps the bas-reliefs served not only as a visual, but also as an acoustic element, directing sound along certain trajectories. In some areas of the walls, the patterns appear unfinished. The lines stop abruptly, as if the artist was interrupted or deliberately left the work in this state. But upon closer examination, it turns out that this incompleteness is just an illusion. The patterns hide transitions that become visible only at certain lighting angles. This suggests that the drawings were created not only for the human eye, but also taking into account the movement of light throughout the day. Perhaps at certain times of the year, the bas-reliefs look different, revealing a second or even third layer of meaning. Some researchers suggest that the bas-reliefs of Mitla could be associated with rituals of transition between worlds. In ancient traditions, geometric patterns were often used to symbolize the paths along which souls traveled. Mitla could be not only a place of life, but also a place of travel. Therefore, the bas-reliefs can be considered as maps of invisible paths used by priests during rituals. This explains their asceticism, lack of figures, and incredible precision. Another hypothesis is that these patterns were part of a complex memory system. In the traditions of some peoples, important knowledge was transmitted through combinations of symbols and lines that served as reminders for initiates. A similar system could have existed in Mitla, but its content was lost along with the bearers of the tradition. Perhaps the bas-reliefs were a way of preserving knowledge not as text, but as structured images, understandable only to those trained in interpretation. Of particular interest is the fact that the engineers who studied the walls noted that the bas-reliefs strengthened the structures of the buildings. The patterns are not just decorative, they distribute the load, reducing the likelihood of wall collapse. This shows that the Mitla craftsmen understood how shape could influence strength and combined art with engineering. However, this understanding does not explain the rich symbolism of the patterns, which clearly goes beyond pure technical necessity. The main problem remains. Why did such a grandiose system of symbols disappear from subsequent cultures of the region? If the bas-reliefs were part of an important tradition, they must have left their mark. But no continuations of this style have been found. It seems that the knowledge behind these patterns has either been lost or deliberately hidden. Perhaps they belong to a small group of priests who did not pass them on to their heirs. Or this knowledge was intended for a certain time after which it lost its meaning. Today, the bas-reliefs of Mitla appear to researchers as a silent book, written in a language that no one understands. Their lines continue to raise questions, their geometry, hypotheses, and their silence is a strange feeling, as if someone left us a message that we are not yet ready to understand. And perhaps this is where their true power lies. They remind us that not all knowledge can be deciphered, and that the ancient world held depths far beyond our expectations. Disappearance of the Tassili culture. In the very heart of the rocky Tassili desert, where time seemed to stand still and the wind of hundreds of centuries carved bizarre shapes into the rocks, there once lived a people known today only by the traces left on the stone walls. These traces are amazing drawings depicting scenes that cannot be associated with the everyday life of desert tribes. Here, among the hot stones and eternal silence, the legacy of a culture that disappeared so mysteriously was preserved that its disappearance became one of the most intriguing mysteries of antiquity. Tassili's most famous heritage is its many rock paintings, preserved due to its dry climate and distance from large settlements. These images depict people, animals, strange figures with rounded heads resembling masks, and even scenes that are difficult to interpret. Creatures seemingly floating in space, people next to strange objects, the shapes of which are not found among local artifacts. Many researchers believe that these scenes could be symbolic, reflecting myths or rituals, but others believe that Tassili's artists depicted what actually happened before their eyes. Particularly noteworthy are the images of large animals that have not been seen in the desert for many thousands of years. Perhaps the climate of Tassili was different in past eras, which contributed to the richness of the fauna. However, what is surprising is not the very presence of animals, but the accuracy with which the artists conveyed their proportions and movements. This suggests that the Tassili culture had highly developed observational skills and a visual tradition spanning several generations. However, traces of settlements characteristic of such a rich art school have been discovered, raising questions about where these people lived and why their traces have disappeared so completely. Some scientists suggest that the Tassili culture may have disappeared due to climate change. The desert gradually expanded, depriving the inhabitants of water and pastures. But this scenario seems too simplistic for such a developed people. If Tassili were truly a vast cultural center, it should have had ways of adapting to climate change. Relocation, the creation of water collection systems, or the adoption of new ways of life. However, no traces of such adaptations were found. The disappearance of the culture happened too quickly, leaving a feeling of suddenness. The mystery is aggravated by the fact that some images on the walls indicate unusual rituals. Some depict groups of people standing in a circle, as if performing an important ritual. Others show figures resembling priests, holding objects that look like vessels or symbols of power. But the most striking thing is the image of people in strange headdresses that resemble closed helmets. Such forms are not found in any other culture in the region. Perhaps these are ritual masks, but their repetition raises questions. The interpretation of images in which figures appear to be connected by lines or surrounded by halos is also subject to considerable controversy. Some researchers believe that these are symbols of spiritual connection. Others suggest that they represent altered states of consciousness that occur during rituals using plants. Another theory is that Tassili artists depicted visions that occurred during ceremonies. Their culture may have been associated with strong spiritual traditions, and the disappearance of the people may be due to changes in their beliefs or social structures. However, this theory does not explain the complete loss of their material heritage. The absence of large burials also remains a mystery. Many ancient peoples had burial complexes that connected people with their ancestors. But the Tassili culture did not leave significant burials. This leads to the hypothesis that their burial customs used short-lived materials such as wood or cloth. It is possible that the bodies were left in places where they would quickly decompose under the influence of nature. However, there is a more symbolic explanation. People may have believed that the body would return to its natural cycle without human intervention, leaving behind only a spiritual essence. Some researchers believe that the disappearance of the Tassili culture is associated with migration. Perhaps people migrated, leaving their lands in search of better living conditions. But migrations usually leave traces, settlements along the route, evidence of adaptation to new conditions and borrowings from other cultures. There are no such traces here. This creates the impression that people did not disappear gradually, but as if they disappeared into thin air. Even if they left, they did so in such a way that they left no trace of their journey. There is a hypothesis that the Tassili culture may not have been a separate people, but a collection of different groups united by common rituals. In this case, their disappearance could be gradual. Groups disintegrated, returned to their tribes, and a single tradition disappeared. But then, why was their overall artistic style so coherent and developed? Such art cannot be created without a long tradition and skilled artisans. Geographic location plays a special role in the investigation. Many of the drawings are located in hard-to-reach places, on high ledges, in deep gorges, under overhanging rocks. Apparently, these places were chosen deliberately. Perhaps they were considered sacred or used for rituals requiring privacy. But why are ritual centers located in such remote and inaccessible places? This gives the impression that the Tassili culture sought to separate itself from the world by creating a space of spiritual concentration, but such isolation makes the disappearance even more mysterious. Some of the images in Tassili are so unusual that they have given rise to theories linking this culture to phenomena that ancient people could not have possessed. However, such theories are not considered within the scientific approach. However, the fact remains. The artists depicted something that still amazes the imagination today. Perhaps they witnessed nature at moments when it manifested itself in an unusual way. Perhaps the visions that arise in altered states of consciousness were so vivid that artists sought to capture them in stone. The disappearance of the Tassili culture is not just the disappearance of a people. This is the disappearance of a world capable of creating complex images, deep symbols, and mysterious scenes. Today, we see only their shadows on the rocks. The Tassili culture disappeared, leaving no storytellers behind. But her images live on, as if waiting for someone to hear their silent story. Granite blocks from Tanisa. In the rocky lands of Thanatos, where a sharp wind lifts dust over the hills and creates the illusion of an incessant rustling, lie granite blocks whose origin has remained a mystery for decades. These massive boulders appear to have been scattered by the hand of a giant, although upon closer inspection, it is clear that their placement is too precise to be random. Some blocks lie flat, others stand upright, and others form linear groups, as if they once served as the foundation of a disappeared structure. However, no traces of walls or buildings were found nearby, which makes the presence of these blocks even more mysterious. The granite from which these blocks are made is different from the rocks common in the Tenisa area. Geologists claim that the nearest deposits of this type of rock are located at a considerable distance. This means that the ancient inhabitants must have transported heavy stone blocks over rough terrain. But how they did it remains unknown. No traces of roads, trails, or special equipment were found. Moreover, the blocks are arranged in such a way that it seems as if they were laid not just with effort, but with calculation. Such careful placement requires not only strength, but also a precise understanding of the weight, balance, and structure of the stone. Some blocks are so huge that their weight is estimated at tens of tons. However, traces of processing are visible on their surfaces. The lines are perfectly straight and the edges are surprisingly smooth for ancient tools. The researchers note that some blocks have thin grooves that could have been made by a chisel. However, such a tool would have to be incredibly durable for granite, and the use of stone or bronze tools would leave completely different marks. This indicates the existence of a stone processing technology that was not preserved in the history of the region. Particularly striking is the way the individual blocks are arranged. In several places, granite boulders rest on a narrow support, as if balancing on a small ledge. This position is extremely unstable and requires extreme precision during installation. Given Tenisa's strong winds, the blocks would have fallen long ago if they had not been positioned with perfectly calculated weight distribution. Modern engineers note that such stability is only possible with precise measurements, which raises doubts that the ancient craftsmen acted at random. However, archaeologists have not discovered any measuring instruments associated with these structures. Some blocks were found to have small holes at regular angles. These holes are too narrow to accommodate wooden wedges or carrying devices. Apparently, these were guide points that could be used when installing blocks. But who made them, and why? And why are holes found only on some stones and not on all? These questions remain unanswered, and attempts to interpret the holes as elements of ritual actions have not yet been confirmed by other finds. There is a theory that Tenisa was an ancient center for stone processing, where artisans created blocks for subsequent transportation to other regions. This theory partially explains the large number of blocks processed. But then, where did the structures themselves go, for the sake of which these blocks were created? No cultural complex corresponding to the scale of production was found in the surrounding area. Moreover, the blocks are too large and too finely machined to be prefabricated blocks for further processing. They look solid, like a finished part of a carefully thought-out structure. Some researchers believe that these blocks could be part of an unfinished megalithic complex. If the builders left the construction site for an unknown reason, they could leave the prepared parts on the ground. But this raises the question, why were such large and heavy elements left in perfect order? Abandoned construction sites tend to look chaotic, while the blocks from Tenisa lie as if they were arranged according to an invisible plan. It is possible that this plan was only partially implemented, and the rest of the complex was never started. Another mystery concerns the orientation of the blocks. Some groups are oriented to the cardinal points with amazing accuracy. This suggests that the stones may have been part of an astronomical system or ritual complex based on the observation of celestial bodies. However, at Tenisa, there are no traces of the religious structures usually associated with such systems. Moreover, the blocks do not form closed figures or circles, characteristic of known astronomical complexes. Their arrangement remains too arbitrary for such an interpretation. Interestingly, small stone objects were also discovered in the Tenisa area, clearly created by the same craftsmen. These objects, fragments of small figurines, broken vessels, or stone slabs, are made in a similar style. This suggests an artistic tradition in the region, but the connection between these small objects and the giant blocks remains unclear. Perhaps these are two parts of the same culture, separated by purpose. Some masters created small objects, others created huge megaliths. Some researchers note a strange harmony in the landscape of Tnissos. The stones are arranged as if they were shaped by the hills, the wind, and even the movement of the sun. This gives the impression that Tnissos was a place where the interaction between man and nature was particularly important. But if this is so, why did the culture that created such monumental forms disappear without leaving behind any history, names, or legends? No answers yet. The granite blocks of Tnissos stand on the dry ground like forgotten stone sentinels. They seem at once foreign and familiar to this place, as if they once belonged to another era or another people, a people forgotten by history. Their rough surfaces, perfect edges, and mysterious landmarks continue to raise questions, and it seems that each block holds its own unique story that cannot be told in words. But there remains a feeling that Tanis is not silent. It seems that his blocks are waiting for us to learn to read their language, the language of stone, silence, and precision. Perhaps their purpose will never be fully revealed. But it is in this ambiguity that their strength lies. They remind us that the past is not always revealed to those who seek answers, but sometimes is revealed to those who are able to see beyond the surface. Stone courtyards of Lysaida. High among the rugged cliffs of Lysaida, where the sun rises slowly and solemnly over the stone ridges, hide courtyards carved by the hands of ancient craftsmen. Lined with heavy slabs of unknown origin, these courtyards look like fragments of a forgotten city, but no residential buildings have been found around them. They are placed unusually evenly, as if they were created simultaneously, although natural traces indicate that the stones have been preserved over many eras. The courtyards are located at different levels on the mountain slopes, and each has its own geometry, as if intended for different types of activities or gatherings. However, their true purpose remains unclear, creating the feeling that Lysaida hides a history that was part of the world but disappeared along with its bearers. The first thing that attracts the attention of researchers is the unusual structure of the stone slabs. They are made of hard rock, rarely found in these mountains. Geologists claim that deposits of this rock are located at a considerable distance, which means that the slabs were brought here deliberately. However, transporting such massive masses over steep slopes is extremely difficult even with modern technology. Upon inspection, it becomes clear that the plates are fitted to each other so precisely that there are practically no visible gaps between them. This gives the impression that the stones were inserted into prepared recesses or worked directly on site, but no traces of intermediate work were found. Each courtyard has its own distinctive features, a flat surface, special angles, and unique acoustics. The sound coming from the courtyard changes depending on where you stand. It's amplified in some places and muted in others, as if the space was designed to channel sound along specific paths. This suggests that courtyards may have been used for meetings or rituals, where the sound of the human voice played an important role. Perhaps the speech of a priest or leader was supposed to sound solemn, passing through stone resonators. However, no images or symbols indicating ritual actions have yet been discovered. An interesting feature of Lysaida is that the courtyards do not form a single system. They are located independently of each other, and there are no traces of roads or paths between them that would indicate the unity of the complex. Some researchers suggest that the courtyards may have been used seasonally or sporadically when groups of people came to the mountains to perform certain tasks. However, this raises new questions. Why were such complex structures built for sporadic use? And who were these people if no traces of permanent residence were found in Lysaida itself? Another mystery is the steps leading to some of the courtyards. These steps are carved directly into the stone, are the same height and width, but do not lead to a building or level ground. They end right at the edge of the yard, creating a theatrical effect as if a person is appearing from above and stepping onto a flat stone surface. This theatrical experience, combined with acoustic characteristics, suggests that the courtyards may have been a revival of an ancient tradition of oral performances, perhaps related to mythological spectacles or storytelling rituals. Some slabs show traces of fine workmanship. Subtle lines appear on their surfaces, forming almost geometric patterns. These lines are too thin to be random cracks. However, their arrangement does not form maps or symbols. They resemble marks left by a tool when smoothing a surface. However, the repetition of lines across different slabs suggests that they may have been part of a ritual system related to the direction of light or shadow. Perhaps at certain times of the year, these lines merged into a larger pattern, visible only under certain lighting conditions. However, no researcher has yet been able to document such a phenomenon. Among the courtyards, one stands out from the rest. It has an irregular oval shape and is surrounded by a low stone wall, barely rising above the ground. The courtyard creates a strange feeling of enclosure, despite the absence of a gate or passage. Its walls slope slightly inward, creating a concentrated sound effect. In the center of the courtyard is a smooth, rounded stone, reminiscent of a natural boulder, but placed too evenly to be accidental. Some believe that this stone may have been a sacrificial altar or a symbol of the spiritual center of the court. However, no bones, ashes, or ritual objects were found in the area. Another theory states that the stone courtyards could have served as astronomical stations. The height of the slopes and open skies create ideal conditions for stargazing. It is possible that the craftsmen of La Isada built the courtyards as landmarks for observing certain constellations at key times of the year. But this raises the question, why are the courtyards arranged so chaotically? If these were astronomical stations, their locations would have to follow a strict pattern. But the geometry of La Isada is too loose for such a purpose, although some horizon lines are still visible. Some researchers point to traces of ancient erosion. The rocks in some yards appeared to have been exposed to heavy water flow. This suggests that La Isada once had streams that no longer exist. In this case, the courtyards could have been created in a different climate. But if the climate changed gradually, why did people so suddenly leave these places, leaving the courtyards in their original form? Perhaps their departure was not due to natural phenomena, but to a cultural or spiritual event. Interestingly, local legends mention people who came to these mountains only for special ceremonies. They did not live here permanently and did not take their belongings with them. They came, performed their rituals, and left, leaving behind only quiet stone courtyards. These legends may be distorted memories of real events. If this is so, then La Isada was indeed a ritual place intended for temporary gatherings of the elite. But what exactly happened here remains a mystery. Some architects who have studied courtyards note the incredible balance of the slabs. They lie as if they were laid down in the absence of gravity. Several of the slabs have small projections that could have served as anchors or support points for lifting structures. However, no remains of wood were found. This suggests that the ancients used methods that did not require wooden mechanisms, perhaps levers, stone wedges, or counterweight systems. However, there is no exact data, and everything remains only speculation. Today, the stone courtyards of La Isada remain silent. They seem to be carved from the very fabric of time. When you stand in the middle of the courtyard and hear the strange echo of your own voice, it seems as if this space remembers every step of those who came here thousands of years ago. The courtyards do not provide answers. They convey only the presence of an ancient world that once lived here and disappeared as silently as the wind blowing along the stone paths. Perhaps one day La Isada will reveal its secret. Or maybe her courtyards were created precisely to remain unfinished. And then their silence is not the absence of sound, but a story that can only be heard with the heart. Cave halls of Ambat. In the depths of the rocky massifs of Ambat, where gorges descend into the ground like mountain roots, and light penetrates only narrow rays, hidden cave halls are striking in their combination of natural forms and the obvious creation of human hands. These halls form a network of spaces connected by passages, but at the same time, they do not look like ordinary caves. Their outlines reveal a geometry too precise to be created by nature alone. Each chamber has its own character, as if designed for a specific purpose, and together they create the impression of a complex underground complex, the purpose of which remains unclear. The first thing researchers notice is the unusual shape of some of the cameras. Instead of the chaotic curves typical of natural cavities, they have almost symmetrical ovals, straight walls, smooth transitions, and vertical planes, as if polished by a tool. However, the ambat rock is too hard to be processed with simple stone tools. On some walls, there are marks that resemble thin stripes, as if left by a constantly moving tool. These stripes run parallel to each other and look as if someone was smoothing the stone layer by layer. However, among the tools found, not a single suitable tool was found. The location of the premises is no less amazing. They do not form a simple chain or ring, but are connected by passages located at different levels. Some passages are too narrow for people to move comfortably, as if they were not intended for everyday use, but for special events. In other places, the aisles are so wide that they give the impression of meeting rooms. However, no traces of permanent habitation, hearths, pottery, or tools were found. The spaces seem to avoid everyday use and belong to the realm of the sacred. In the center of the Ambat complex is the largest chamber, which has attracted the attention of researchers for many years. It is shaped like an almost perfect dome, and its floor is so smooth that it appears polished. In the center of the chamber, there is a rounded stone standing on a thin base and seemingly floating in the air. Geologists consider this a natural formation, but its location is too precise. The stone stands exactly in the center, and around it, there are concentric lines running in different directions. These lines are barely noticeable and could be traces of surface smoothing or part of a ritual pattern. The acoustic properties of the chambers proved particularly useful for the study. In some of them, the sound is amplified so much that a slight whisper turns into a deep, resonant tone that reflects off the stone. This phenomenon is reminiscent of natural resonators, but here it seems to have a pronounced direction. As soon as a person takes a step to the side, the effect disappears. This may indicate that the cameras were designed with acoustic properties in mind. Perhaps the ancient inhabitants of Ambat used sound in their rituals. It is no coincidence that in some cultures sound was considered a bridge between worlds. Perhaps it played an important role here too. Another mystery is the presence of smooth vertical holes going into the floor or ceiling. These holes have almost the same diameter and perfectly smooth walls. Their purpose remains a matter of debate. Some believe that they served for ventilation, but their location is unusual. The holes often lead not to the surface, but into voids located above or below. Perhaps they had symbolic meaning or were used in rituals related to the movement of air. Another theory is that light passed through them at certain times of the year, creating a play of sun and shadow within the rooms that could have ritual significance. Interestingly, there are no images or inscriptions on the walls of the cells. Unlike many ancient complexes, Ambat avoids symbolism, leaving only the spatial structure. This creates the feeling that the shapes and sounds themselves were the main language of the complex. Perhaps the rituals performed here did not require images. But such minimalism is unusual and raises questions about the worldview of the people who created Ambat. Some researchers have found signs of erosion on the lower parts of the walls. These marks are consistent with the effects of prolonged exposure to water. This led to a bold hypothesis. Ambat could have been created or used during a period of significantly more humid climate. If these chambers actually contained standing water, they may have been part of a reservoir system. But in that case, why were they aligned with such precision? And how to explain the acoustic effects that would disappear when the chambers filled with water? These questions undermine the water hypothesis, making it incomplete. Astronomical theories were also put forward. Some passages are oriented in such a way that on certain days sunlight penetrates deep into the chambers, creating an unusual glow inside. This could be related to calendar rituals important for agricultural or spiritual practices. However, exact matches with key points in the solar cycle are rare, and so far this theory remains only a hypothesis. Another detail is the footprints, similar to footprints, carved into the slopes leading to the entrances to the chambers. These tracks are positioned as if people had walked up the rock directly to the entrances, and such tracks must have been used regularly. But if the complex was often used, why are there so few traces of habitation inside? Perhaps the Ambat complex was a place for special and rare rituals, accessible only to a select few. Then the absence of everyday items becomes clear. People came here only for rituals. In one of the side halls, an unusual phenomenon was discovered. When a person stands at a certain point, his voice resonates in such a way that the impression of the presence of another person is created. Acousticists studied this phenomenon and confirmed that it was related to the shape of the walls and dome. The site may have been known as a meeting place where people felt the presence of ancestral spirits. In ancient cultures, such effects were often considered signs of the presence of the spirit world. Local legends say that Ambat was a place where people came to communicate with mountain spirits. These legends, of course, cannot be considered an accurate description of the past, but they may indicate an ancient tradition associated with underground spaces. People could believe that in the depths of the stone, there were forces that could provide answers or blessings. Perhaps the cave complex was used to immerse oneself in unusual states of consciousness, where a person felt a connection with nature and his ancestors. The cave halls of Ambat are a space created on the border between nature and man. They do not look like a temple, nor a dwelling, nor an ordinary sanctuary. Rather, they resemble a place of transition, a border between worlds, where people came to hear what was not heard on the surface. Today, they continue to maintain their deep silence, and everyone who stands in their center feels as if the stone is listening. Perhaps the secret of Ambat lies not in the walls themselves, but in what happened inside, in those ancient voices and thoughts that dissolved in stone and time. Terraces of ancient cadmium deposits. High in the Rocky Mountains, where the slopes rise into steep cliffs and seem inaccessible, are scattered terraces created by a people whose name is preserved only in legends, the ancient Cadmi. These terraces are stepped platforms laid out of stone with such care that some researchers doubt they could have been created with primitive tools alone. They clung to the mountains, rising one above the other like a giant staircase leading neither to the city nor to the temple. And yet, each of their elements radiates a certain intention, an intention the meaning of which has long been erased from the face of the earth. The first mystery that researchers face is the location of the terraces. They are located in areas with little soil and even less water. No farmer would build such complex stone platforms in a place where growing crops is practically impossible. This casts doubt on the hypothesis about the agricultural purpose of the terraces. Moreover, the surfaces of the terraces themselves are too smooth, almost polished, to serve as planting areas. Some suggest that the terraces were used to collect rainwater. However, they do not show signs of channels, depressions, or drainage channels typical of water collection systems. However, the terraces are located with amazing precision. Their corners are aligned with the horizon, and some areas are oriented towards sunny points at certain times of the year. This suggests that the terraces may have served an astronomical function. They may have served as platforms for observing the sky. But then the question arises, why are there so many of them? If the goal was surveillance, multiple platforms would suffice. But the Cadmians built dozens of terraces, each of which required enormous labor costs. Another hypothesis is related to ritual actions. The terraces could have been paths along which the participants of the ceremonies moved. The steps between platforms are sometimes too high, making them inconvenient for normal movement. But if these actions were of a sacred nature, then the difficulty of the ascent could be part of the ritual. In some cultures, the transition from one level to another symbolized the transition between worlds or states of consciousness. Perhaps the cadmium terraces served as an initiation route. Interestingly, the walls of the terrace were built from stones of various shapes. Some are rectangular, smoothly and precisely machined, while others retain their natural shape but are laid in such a way as to give the impression of a monolithic surface. This combination of natural and artificial seems to be part of the design, as if the craftsmen were trying to combine nature and human creativity. The stones fit so tightly together that even after many centuries, cracks between them are difficult to detect. Such precision indicates a high level of stoneworking skill. However, there are no traces of tool processing on the surfaces of the terraces. No scratches, no grooves, as if the stones had been polished by some unknown method. This suggests that the Cadmi may have known a method of softening the stone, similar to the legends of other peoples, thanks to which the stone became pliable, like clay. Of course, there is no practical evidence for this, but the terraces themselves give the impression that the stones from which they were built were processed with extraordinary ease and precision. Another oddity is the lack of infrastructure, usually inherent in such architectural structures. There are no roads or permanent settlements nearby. It would seem that such grandiose walls should have been part of a larger complex. However, excavations did not even reveal the remains of dwellings. This led to the hypothesis that cadmiums came here only periodically, perhaps at special times of the year. Terraces could then serve as temporary gathering centers or sites for festivals associated with the cyclical changes of nature. Among the terraces, one stands out, having the shape of an elongated ellipse, and its surface is slightly inclined. At certain angles of incidence of the sun, the shadow from the surrounding wall falls on its surface, creating an unusual image. Researchers have noticed that in the middle of the spring cycle, the shadow takes on a shape resembling a human silhouette. Perhaps this was part of a ritual symbolizing the appearance of an ancestor, hero, or deity. However, an exact match between the shadow and the figure is difficult, and this phenomenon could be accidental. It is assumed that the terraces were not independent structures, but were part of a sound transmission system. On some of them, sound spreads in a striking way. If you speak in one corner of the terrace, the voice will be heard on the other side, but not in the center. This suggests that the terraces could have been places for speech or musical rituals, where sound acted as a conductor. However, the terraces are located too far from each other to form a single acoustic system. Some elements of the terraces resemble places where astronomical observations were made. Stones located on the edge of the platform are sometimes oriented in relation to certain stars. Scientists are trying to link these orientations to important celestial events. However, not enough matches have yet been found to create a comprehensive astronomical system. It is possible that the cadmiums only used certain terraces for celestial observations, while others served other purposes. The most mysterious thing about these terraces is the feeling of incompleteness. Some sites appear perfectly symmetrical and complete, while others look as if they have just begun to be built. The walls end abruptly, the surface is uneven, and the stones are laid as if the craftsmen were not yet finished. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that these are not signs of unfinished construction, but part of the plan. They seem unfinished only by modern standards. It is possible that the cadmiums built the terraces gradually, following cycles rather than aiming to complete them within a specific time frame. Some researchers suggest that the terraces could serve as a kind of map. When viewed from above, their arrangement forms a pattern reminiscent of a geometric figure. It could have been a map of the area or a diagram associated with Cadmean myths. However, the form is too abstract to be related to the terrain. Instead, it may be associated with ritual geography, a vision of a world in which each terrace occupied a symbolic place. Legends passed down from generation to generation among neighboring peoples speak of cadmiums as builders, able to create stone shapes without difficulty. They came to the mountains only on special days, when the rocks opened their hearts. This is, of course, just a poetic image, but it reinforces the idea that terraces were not part of everyday life. They are rare, hard to find, and crafted with such care as if they were built not for people, but for the land itself. Today, the cadmium terraces rise like vast pages of stone inscribed with a language lost to the world. Their steps resemble the footprints of giants, and the walls resemble fragmentary lines of a poem composed by nature and ancient masters. And although we do not know why they were created, one thing is clear. They were part of a world where man sought to communicate with the mountains, the sky, and time. Perhaps the terraces were a meeting place for people united by great cycles, or perhaps a reflection of ancient knowledge waiting for those who could hear it anew. Underground galleries of Agia Nicola. Deep beneath the hills of Agia Nicola lies a world created not by nature, but by the hands of those whose names have long been erased from memory. These underground galleries, extending hundreds of meters deep into the earth, form a network of corridors, halls, and secret chambers so intricately crafted that they were long considered ancient by early explorers. But analysis of the rock and traces of tools shows that the galleries were indeed created many centuries ago, long before the appearance of known settlements in the area. Who built them and why? There are no answers, only traces carving a riddle into the stone itself. The Agia Nicola galleries differ from other underground structures due to their excessive symmetry. Most of the passages are the same width and height, and their walls are carved with such precision that in places they appear polished. This is surprising given the hardness of the rock in which they are carved. The carving marks do not resemble the blows of a stone tool. They are too smooth, as if the surface was polished not by blows, but by the movement of a wide, flat blade. But what kind of weapon it could be remains unknown. Some galleries have a unique shape, long corridors that taper towards one end. This geometry creates an interesting acoustic effect. A sound pronounced in a narrow part is amplified, reflecting many times. This feature could be used in rituals. Imagine an ancient priest pronouncing ritual words, and the walls amplify them, turning them into polyphonic sound that is reflected back. It is quite possible that the galleries were built as spaces for spiritual practices, where the human voice acquired a different, almost mystical sound. However, there are other passages that are completely devoid of resonance. There the sound fades away, as if space itself absorbs it. These areas seem especially strange. Absorbing acoustics is only possible with a certain shape of the walls or the presence of microscopic cavities in the rock. But in the galleries of Agia Nicola, such effects seem deliberate, as if the builders knew how to distribute the space so that the sound would disappear. Perhaps these places served as places of silence, where meditation or rituals were performed that required complete absorption of sound. One of the most mysterious finds in the galleries were vertical shafts extending up and down. Some of them end in small chambers, while others are empty holes. They are too narrow to serve as passages, but their placement is too deliberate to be random. It was hypothesized that the shafts served for ventilation. But this raises the question, why is ventilation needed in a place where there is no sign of constant human presence? The shafts may have been used as channels for light. On certain days, sunlight does reach some of the lower chambers. However, such coincidences are too rare for this to be the main function of the mines. What makes the Agia Nicola galleries particularly mysterious is the absence of any objects that could be associated with their use. No bones, no ceramics, no metal elements, no traces of fire. This suggests that the galleries were either carefully cleaned or were used at a time and for activities that did not leave material traces. Perhaps the entire complex was a space for special rituals, where the main role was played not by the material world, but by the stone itself, sound, darkness, and light. Some researchers believe that the galleries may have been part of a network of secret routes connecting different parts of the region. However, this theory faces a serious problem. The galleries do not lead to other settlements. They form a closed system, not connected to the surface by any large tunnels. This suggests that they were not built for travel, but for staying inside, perhaps short-lived, but filled with meaningful meaning. Interestingly, in some halls of the galleries, depressions were discovered in the floor, reminiscent of the remains of vessels or stands. Their shape is perfectly round, as if they were created specifically to accommodate a specific item. But what exactly is unknown? Perhaps these recesses contained stone bowls filled with water or oil. Water could serve as a mirror, reflecting light or sunlight, creating a play of light in the halls. Similar phenomena are known in various ancient cultures. However, there are no traces of soot in Agia Nicola, which suggests that fire was used very rarely or even completely. It is believed that the galleries could serve as places of initiation. Narrow corridors alternating with spacious halls create the feeling of traveling through different states. In one place, a person can hear amplified sound. In another, silence. Light entered the halls only at certain moments, emphasizing symbolic transitions. Perhaps the new initiates passed through the galleries to experience fear, awe, and a sense of the presence of another power. The absence of objects is therefore understandable. Rituals were based not on material objects, but on experiences. Local legends include stories of stone roads under the mountain where the footsteps of those long gone can be heard. These stories are, of course, folklore, but they describe the acoustic effects of the galleries with amazing accuracy. Perhaps folk memory retained echoes of ancient rituals that included sound, darkness, and movement. But who performed these rituals and in what era they existed is unknown. There is a bolder hypothesis. The galleries could serve as a place for observing the stars underground. Some cultures believed in stargates, places where the human spirit could connect with the heavens. The vertical shafts of Agia Nicola could symbolize these connections. When starlight entered the lower chamber, it could be considered a sign. But this interpretation is too symbolic and not supported by archaeological evidence. However, in the absence of other explanations, it finds its supporters. Despite all the research, the underground galleries of Agia Nicola continue to amaze with their perfection. They resemble architecture created not for habitation, but for a different perception of the world. Every shape, every turn seems thought out. Every chamber is filled with meaning that we cannot yet comprehend. The galleries seem to be waiting for someone who can hear their language, the language of stone, silence, and light. Today, researchers walk along these ancient corridors, listening to every echo, studying every line. And yet the feeling remains the same, as if the galleries were created in order to remain unsolved. Perhaps their purpose should never be fully restored. Perhaps the mystery of Agia Nicola itself is part of their essence, preserved by the ancient masters as a reminder that there are places in the world where a person should experience not knowledge, but awe. Calpatra stony cells. High on the ledges of Calpatra, where the morning mist slides across the stone like the ancient smoke of the past, lie stone chambers, small chambers carved into the rock with such precision that their origin is still a matter of debate. These chambers form a complex connected by narrow paths that sometimes appear too smooth to be natural formations. Entering here, you experience a strange sensation. The space seems both open and hidden, as if it holds knowledge that is not intended for everyone. The first thing that strikes researchers is the size of the cells. They are unusually small. They can barely accommodate a full-length person and leave virtually no room for movement. This led to the original theory that the cells served as places of solitude and meditation. But even for such practices, the space seems too cramped. In some cells, there is only one small niche, reminiscent of a sitting position. In others, the ceilings slope upward, creating the impression of a well that lets in light in the middle of the day. These rays, entering the cell, form an even column of light, illuminating only the center of the room. This design seems too clever to be accidental. No less striking are the traces of work on the walls. The stone in Kalpatra is hard and layered, making it difficult to process even with metal tools. But the surfaces of the cameras are smooth, as if polished. In some places, thin lines running parallel to each other are visible. They do not look like signs of cutting or chipping. Rather, they resemble signs of slow, even wear. It is possible that the craftsman used sand or an abrasive substance, but the volume of work is so large that this explanation seems insufficient. This is especially true given the location of the cameras in difficult-to-reach areas, requiring enormous effort to transport materials and tools. A particularly mysterious feature is the system of holes located at the top of the cells. These holes are almost identical in diameter and slightly inclined upward. At first glance, it seems that they served for ventilation. However, when analyzing air movement, the researchers noticed that the holes create a suction effect. Air enters the cell, flows along the walls, and exits through another channel. This distribution is not necessary for ventilation, but to maintain a certain humidity and temperature. This suggests that the cells were used for procedures requiring control of respiration or air quality. Some cells are connected by narrow passages. These passages are not suitable for women and children, only for adults of average build. The passages are located at such an angle that crawling through them is difficult but possible. This has led to the hypothesis that passing through these narrow spaces was part of a purification ritual. In some traditions, such passages symbolize birth or transcendence. If this is so, then the cells could serve as places of initiation, where a person underwent a physical test and then entered a space of silence. The deepest cell of Kalpatra especially attracted the attention of researchers. It has the shape of a vertical cylinder, descending almost to the level of human height. There are marks on its walls that resemble carved steps, but they are too small to walk on. Perhaps they served as a support for the hands. If a person went down inside, he found himself in complete darkness, surrounded by stone on all sides. In such a place, the feeling of space completely disappears. Some experts believe that such isolation could induce an altered state of consciousness similar to deep meditation. However, not all cameras are created equal. Some have an irregular oval shape. Their acoustics are different. The sound inside behaves strangely, as if it condenses and returns to the person in an altered form. The effect resembles an echolocation wave. It has been hypothesized that these chambers could serve as places for sound-making practices. In some traditions, sound was considered the key to understanding the world, and the use of such spaces could be part of spiritual exercises. But why are the cells located so high? Reaching them requires climbing over rocks, and even experienced explorers sometimes spend hours just to reach a small area. If the cells were used for spiritual practices, then the difficulty of climbing could be part of the ritual. However, the lack of evidence of permanent residence in the surrounding area suggests that the site was rarely visited. No hearths, no animal bones, no pottery were found. Nothing that would indicate domestic activity. The cells seem to have been intended exclusively for short visits. In some parts of Kalpatra, traces of ancient paths leading to groups of cells have been discovered. These paths are too smooth and narrow to be shepherd paths. The stone is worn, as if many people have walked on it. But if so many people came up here, why are there so few traces inside the cells? Perhaps only a small number of those who stood up went inside, while the rest remained outside, minding their own business. This creates an image of ancient groups participating in complex, multi-step rituals. Some researchers believe that these chambers were associated with practices of silence. The space inside is so limited that a person is forced to remain motionless. Any movement produces a sound that reflects off the walls, breaking the silence. Perhaps this was part of training in attention, contemplation, or even preparation for the role of a priest. In such conditions, a person could hear his own breathing, heartbeat, and the sounds of his own body, which led to a deep sense of inner peace. Local legends include the story of people who could listen to the stone. According to legend, these people climbed Kalpatra to spend the night in a cramped cell where the stone was believed to speak to them. Of course, this description is symbolic, but it reflects the idea that the cells were intended for contact with nature, with its deep forces. Perhaps the ancient inhabitants of Kalpatra believed that the voices of their ancestors were preserved in stone and that staying inside the cells helped them hear them. Recently, researchers discovered an interesting detail. Some cells are ideally oriented to the cardinal points. On certain days of the year, light enters through a small hole and falls exactly on a niche in the wall. Perhaps this was related to calendar rituals. However, there are few such coincidences, and they do not form a single pattern. This suggests that only some cells were used for astronomical purposes, while the rest performed other functions. The stone cells of Kalpatra are a space created not for life, but for inner experience. They resemble stone vessels where a person can remain alone with himself, in silence, alone with the breath of the earth. And yet their creation required enormous labor, lifting stones, carving solid rock, creating precise landmarks. Why did ancient people take on such a task? Why did they choose these particular stones? There are no answers. The cells continue to stand among the mountains, watching the sky and the wind. And it seems that they were created not to keep a secret, but to remind us that a person is able to reach the very depths, both external and internal. The secret of the ritual tablets of Kahir. On the elevated plateaus of Kagira, among dry steppes and rocky outcrops, lie mysterious ritual slabs, huge stone surfaces, carefully aligned and decorated with fine lines, the purpose of which remains unclear. The slabs lie in groups, sometimes forming rectangular platforms, sometimes elongated ovals, but always in places that offer a wide view of the horizon. Each slab is a massive stone slab, as if carved from a single monolith. Their surface is so smooth that it appears polished, although no traces of abrasives or tools were found. The first thing that catches the researcher's eye is the exact orientation of the plates. Many of them are aligned precisely with the cardinal directions, while others are located at angles that coincide with the position of the sun at certain times of the year. This suggests that the slabs could have been used for astronomical observations. However, there are no indentations or grooves on their surface that could serve as marks. Instead, thin lines are visible, sometimes straight, sometimes slightly curved, running from the center to the edges. These lines may be natural cracks, but their repeatability, parallelism, and direction indicate artificial origin. Some researchers suggest that these slabs served as a kind of celestial map on which ancient masters marked the positions of the stars. But if this is true, then where is the body of knowledge corresponding to such a system? Kahir is not known to be the center of a written tradition, and no accompanying texts have been found to explain the meaning of the slabs. This leads some experts to believe that knowledge was passed down orally, and the slabs were used as a visual aid. Perhaps the priests gathered here at night, watched the sky, and compared the visible stars with the lines on the slabs. Another hypothesis is related to ritual activity. The slabs could serve as places for ceremonies related to transitions, purification, or sacrifices. On some slabs there are traces that resemble small, round, smooth depressions. They are too precise to be natural. Perhaps they contained vessels, objects, or symbols. However, there are few such depressions, and there is no evidence of fire or liquids that could be used in rituals. This makes the theory incomplete, rather than complete. One slab covered with a system of interconnected lines attracts particular attention. When viewed from above, the lines form a complex geometric pattern that resembles a spiral. This spiral is oriented as if directing the eye to a specific point on the horizon. This point may have been important in ancient astronomical observations. However, it is difficult to associate it with known constellations. The coincidence is only partial. Some experts believe that the line indicated the moment a certain star appeared above the horizon. But if this is so, then why such a complex system? Even more mysterious is the surface of some slabs covered with thin, almost imperceptible circles. These circles are difficult to see in normal lighting, but they become clearly visible at a low angle of incidence of sunlight. The circles are concentrically arranged, but their radii are uneven. All this resembles a measurement system based on dividing space into parts. Some archaeologists suggest that the slabs were used to study the movements of the sun and moon. But why such precision if people did not have a complex written tradition? The stone from which the slabs are made poses another mystery. It is a dense rock found in only a few places in the region. But on the Kagir Plateau itself there is no such breed. This means that the slabs were brought here from another place. Each of them weighs more than tens of tons. How could ancient people transport such huge masses over significant distances and lift them to high plateaus? Archaeologists have found no traces of the roads, equipment, or temporary settlements needed for such work. Unusual markings were found on the underside of some of the slabs. These are small protrusions that resemble attachment points. They may have served as stabilizers, holding the slabs in place. However, such solutions are extremely rare in ancient architecture. The builders may have used complex balancing techniques to level the surface at a certain angle. However, the lack of written evidence makes it difficult to understand exactly how this was achieved. There is a theory that the slabs in Kagir could be places where rituals related to water were performed. On some slabs, barely noticeable grooves are visible, converging at one point. These furrows are too shallow to allow water to be driven through them for practical purposes. However, they could be used for ritual ablutions, where water flowing over the stone symbolized purification or transition. However, there is virtually no trace of the constant presence of water in Kagir. The climate is too dry. This leaves open the question of the meaning of such rituals. Of particular interest is the discovery of small stone pillars next to some of the slabs. These posts are too small to serve as supports, but their location suggests a possible connection with the orientation of the slabs. They may have served as markers or observation points, or perhaps as signs marking the boundaries of sacred territory. However, the relationship between columns and slabs is not yet fully understood. One of the most daring hypotheses suggests that the slabs served as a kind of mirrors for light. Their smooth surface could reflect the sun's rays over long distances. If several plates were connected in a chain, they could transmit light signals. But such chains do not exist. Or they existed, but were destroyed by time. But why did ancient people need such alarm systems? For communication, for rituals, for orientation. All these theories leave too many questions unanswered. There is also a legend that the slabs in Kagir were ancestral tables. Offerings were made to the spirits on them, and the lines and circles served as a pattern for communicating with the spirit world. Such legends cannot be scientifically explained, but they reflect the attitude of local residents towards the slabs: respect, fear, a sense of holiness. Perhaps Kagir really was a place where people sought to establish a connection with the invisible world through stone and light. Today, the ritual tablets of Kagir remain in place, like fragments of an ancient code carved in stone. Their lines, concentric circles, smooth surfaces, all this speaks of the great design of those who created them. But this plan remains beyond our understanding, and it seems that the slabs do not hide a secret. They themselves are a secret. Stone bridges of Machu Picchu. High on the misty Machu Picchu plateau, where the peaks are hidden by clouds and paths meander along rocky slopes, mysterious stone bridges lie. Narrow crossings over crevices and ledges, as if connecting parts of a lost world. These bridges are so ancient that time has erased almost all traces of their creators, but the structures themselves are surprisingly well preserved. They seem to resist destruction while the surrounding rocks crumble under the force of wind and rain. Each bridge is a perfectly calibrated structure of massive stone blocks, laid with such precision that the seams between them are almost invisible. The first thing that strikes researchers is the location of the bridges. They are located in places that are difficult to reach even for experienced climbers. Some bridges connect two rocks separated by deep chasms, while others are located so high above the ground that it seems incredible how ancient craftsmen could have transported such heavy stone blocks there. No traces of scaffolding or other temporary structures remained. It seems that the bridges were built from prefabricated elements. They fit so harmoniously into the environment. Each span consists of stone blocks, processed with amazing precision. Their edges are straight and even, as if carved with modern tools. There are no traces of mortar between the blocks, but the seams are so tight that even a thin sheet of paper cannot fit through the gap. Geologists note that the stone used in the spans is different from the surrounding rock, indicating that it was specially transported. But exactly how the blocks were delivered remains a mystery. No traces of old roads or remains of machinery were found in the surrounding area. Some researchers suggest that these bridges were part of a larger road system that crossed the mountains. However, there are no smooth roads or places to rest. The pavements do not lead to each other, but into the unknown. They connect areas of rocks on which there are no traces of settlements. Perhaps the road really existed, but its traces disappeared under the weight of time. Or perhaps the road had a spiritual meaning, and the bridges were symbols of a journey reserved only for a select few. Another mystery is the shape of some spans. They are not just straight, but have a slight bend that fits perfectly into the horizon. This bending increases the stability of the structure, but requires high engineering precision. Creating such a bend by hand, without sophisticated tools, is extremely difficult. But the ancient Machu Picchu craftsmen succeeded, as if they had knowledge of the strength of materials that was not preserved in other cultures in the region. Interestingly, thin parallel lines were found on some blocks, barely noticeable marks reminiscent of planing marks. They pass smoothly and continuously over the surface of the block. Such lines are difficult to explain by the influence of primitive tools. Perhaps the craftsmen used stone or wooden tools that had unusual properties, but achieving such smoothness would require years of work. This suggests that Machu Picchu masters have mastered a unique stone polishing technique based on gradual abrasive action and polishing. One of the most amazing features is that these spans can withstand incredible loads. Despite high altitudes, strong winds, temperature changes, and earthquakes, they remain virtually undamaged. The stones of which they are composed appear to be held together by an internal force that prevents collapse. Some scientists suggest that the blocks are connected by a system of hidden grooves, but no direct evidence has been found for this. Perhaps the ancient craftsmen used a method in which the stones were fitted so tightly that they formed a monolith. Several small stone platforms were discovered near some of the spans. They are too small to serve as resting places, but are arranged as if intended for observation. Perhaps these sites were part of a ritual during which a person would stop and look at the flyover or view before moving on. In such places, there is a special tension in the air, as if the space remembers the steps of those who once crossed these stone bridges. It is believed that the Machu Picchu flybys served an astronomical function. Some of them were strictly oriented to certain points on the horizon, coinciding with sunrise on the equinoxes. However, not all spans follow this logic. Only a small number are perfectly oriented, while the rest are arranged in an unobservable order. This suggests that celestial orientation may have played a role, but was not the primary function. The longest flight of stairs, almost 40 meters long, is particularly impressive, connecting two rocky outcroppings separated by a deep chasm. Its surface is slightly inclined, and when walking it gives the feeling of climbing a flight of stairs, although in fact the level begins to decrease. This is an optical illusion created by the landscape. Perhaps this illusion was part of the design of the ancient masters. A person walking down a flight of stairs would feel a symbolic ascent, although in reality he was descending. Some researchers believe that these bridges could serve as spiritual passages. In mountain cultures, the concept of bridges connecting the human world and the spirit world is often found. Such bridges do not have to be real roads. They can be places where rituals are performed. In Machu Picchu, the bridges really look like boundaries between worlds. On one side, there are familiar rocks. On the other, there is an abyss symbolizing the unknown. But if these bridges served as a spiritual center, why are there so few signs of human habitation around them? No fires, no pottery, no decorations. Perhaps rituals were performed extremely rarely, and participants came without objects in order to maintain the purity of the ritual. Or perhaps these rituals were so secret that only a few had access to the bridges. Some archaeologists have noted the unusual acoustics of some of the spans. If you stand in their center and speak a word, the sound becomes distorted, as if passing through a subtle resonance. This may be a coincidence, but the repeatability of this phenomenon is doubtful. Sound may have played an important role in Machu Picchu rites. The combination of wind, stone, and human voice could create the effect of the presence of some other force. Local legends include stories of spiritual bridges that cannot be crossed without blessing. People said that some bridges singed in the wind. These legends cannot be considered historical sources, but they convey the attitude of local residents towards these stone structures: fear, respect, and reverence for what surpasses human understanding. Today, the stone bridges of Machu Picchu continue to stand over the abysses, filled with silence and ancient strength. It seems that they were created not by people, but by the mountain itself, and were only lined with stone, the result of human labor. Bridges give the feeling that they are guarding the path. But where is the path? Perhaps in ancient times their purpose was so obvious that it did not require explanation. Today they remain symbols of a mysterious skill, lost along with the people who knew how to connect earth and sky through stone. And it seems that these flights are not just a road. This is a test, an experience of silence, heights, and ancient mystery that makes the heart skip a beat and the mind look for answers where only stones and wind left them. Disappearance of the Lambu people. Among the scorched plains of Lambu, where the earth is cracked by the heat, and it seems as if nature itself has turned away from these places, there once lived a people about whom almost nothing is known today. Lambu is surrounded by myths, fragments of legends, and rare archaeological finds that do not allow us to form a complete picture. They disappeared so suddenly that researchers are still debating whether these people were weak and vulnerable, or, on the contrary, had deep knowledge that allowed them to survive in harsh conditions. The disappearance of Lambu remains one of the most mysterious chapters of ancient history. The first thing that is surprising is the lack of evidence of destruction. The disappearance of a people is usually associated with conflict, disaster, or gradual decline. But at Lambu, archaeologists found no traces of fires, weapons, destroyed forts, or signs of violence. On the contrary, the remains of settlements found appear to have disappeared peacefully, leaving their homes untouched. In some places, household items were found: vessels, tools, and jewelry, neatly folded and covered with a layer of dust. It seems as if the people of Lambu deliberately left their homes, hoping to return, but never returned. The architecture of Lambu is striking in its simplicity. The settlements were located around round platforms paved with smooth stones. These platforms could serve as meeting places, ritual sites, or trading posts. But what attracts attention is their unusual structure. The stones are laid so evenly that they create the effect of a continuous plane. On some platforms, traces of thin lines were found running from the center to the edges, which apparently divide the platform into sectors. This could be related to calendar observations or ritual activities, but the exact meaning of these lines remains unknown. It is also noteworthy that the Lambu people possessed complex stone processing techniques. Their tools, found during excavations, show unusual symmetry, and some of them are strikingly smooth. However, no traces of quarries or mass production sites were found. Perhaps the Lambu used processing methods based on the natural properties of the stone, or had secret workshops located in hard-to-reach places. But why there are no traces of them, even in the form of fragments or waste, remains a mystery. Another unique element of the Lambu culture were the strange stone rings found in several settlements. These rings, cut from a single stone, have an ideal shape and the same diameter. Some researchers believe that they served as symbols of power or belonging. Others suggest that the rings were used in rituals related to the sun or stars, but not a single image or symbol explaining their meaning was found. Apparently, the Lambu rings were carved solely to conceal their meaning. The Lambu trails remain a particular mystery, long, straight lines stretching for many kilometers across the plain. These paths are paved with small stones, and their orientation is so level that it seems unlikely that such a thing existed among a people who did not have sophisticated tools. Some of the trails lead nowhere. They end on hillsides or disappear into the sand. These may have been roads leading to sacred sites, or perhaps the paths were used for rituals related to the movement of the sun. But the absence of any related items leaves this question open. The most surprising discovery was that Lambu settlements were often located in places where long-term habitation was impossible due to lack of water. This led to the hypothesis that the people had a method of obtaining water that has not survived to this day. Some researchers suggest that the Lambu created hidden reservoirs or used the properties of certain plants. However, there is no evidence for this. Perhaps water had not only practical, but also sacred significance for the Lambu, and settlements were located in ritual places and not in areas suitable for habitation. Among the few artifacts found at Lambu, researchers found small stone tablets with thin lines resembling writing. But if this is really a letter, then it is unique and has no analogues in the region. The lines are too abstract and non-repetitive to be a common system. These may be ritual diagrams, maps, or symbolic structures. However, the similarity of tablets from different settlements indicates the presence of a certain tradition. One of the boldest hypotheses suggests that the Lambu people migrated, disappearing not suddenly, but gradually. However, such migration would leave traces, new settlements, borrowing of cultural elements by neighboring peoples. But no known settlements in the surrounding region contain traces of Lambu. This creates the impression that the people disappeared not as a result of displacement, but as a result of disintegration, as if they had disappeared from the stage of history without a trace. Some researchers believe that the Lambus may have been a special type of nomad, spiritual or ritual nomads who spent most of their time on the move. Their settlements, therefore, could have been temporary centers to which they returned only at certain moments. But why were such centers abandoned without traces of long-term use? Perhaps their lifestyle was different from that of agricultural or warrior cultures. Local legends include the tale of the people of Stone Silence, whose footprints left no trace. They said that the Lambu left at night when a thick fog fell on the ground and disappeared into it. This is, of course, just a metaphor, but it conveys the basic feeling that arises when studying this culture. The Lambu people were as fickle as a shadow, and their disappearance was as inexplicable as their appearance. One is left with the feeling that the Lambu lived in a world where time and space were perceived differently than ours. Their stone platforms, lines, and rings are like fragments of a language that we cannot yet read. They left traces too subtle to become history, but too noticeable to disappear without a trace. The disappearance of the Lambu people remains not just a fact, but a mystery, shrouded in silence, as if the steppe itself kept the secret of those who knew how to live in its harsh breath. Cave complexes of Latmos. In the rocky gorges of Latmos, where morning mists flow down the slopes like clear rivers, hide cave complexes of amazing scale and mystery. These caves are not like ordinary natural formations. Their shape is too regular, the passages are too linear, and the arrangement of the chambers is too deliberate for the chaotic laws of nature. Latmos is shrouded in a special silence, as if the space had absorbed the breath of many centuries and preserved it in its stone depths. The first thing researchers notice is the unusual architecture of some of the halls. They are almost perfectly rectangular or circular in shape, and their walls are so precisely aligned that they appear to be carved out as one monolith. In some places, the stone surface looks polished, as if with a special tool, but no such tool was found in this region. The marks on the walls do not resemble the blows of a stone hammer. Rather, they resemble thin parallel grooves running at a constant angle. This suggests that the ancient craftsmen used a method that has been lost over time. A series of narrow passages connect the central halls with the side rooms. These passages are sometimes so narrow that a person has to squeeze through sideways. However, the side rooms themselves are spacious and have unusual acoustics. When a person speaks in one of them, the sound is reflected in many subtle, soft echo effects, as if the walls were made of many thin plates. This acoustic phenomenon is difficult to explain by natural causes. Perhaps the craftsmen intentionally created this effect using the properties of the stone. Some of the halls of Latmos have holes in the ceilings through which sunlight enters at certain times of the year. These rays fall exactly in the center of the room, creating a bright circle of light. Depending on the position of the sun, these halls could serve as ritual rooms where ceremonies were held. When a beam of light touches the center of the room, it creates the feeling of the presence of some powerful force, and even modern researchers find it difficult to get rid of this impression. However, not all rooms are oriented in the same way, which indicates the lack of a unified system. The drawings found on the walls of some cells pose a special mystery. They depict people, animals, and strange figures with elongated bodies, but they are executed in such a stylized manner that their content is difficult to discern. Unlike other ancient paintings in the region, the images on Latmos do not strive for realism. They are more like symbols, where the idea is important, not the appearance. Some researchers believe that these drawings are part of a ritual system in which each element has its own meaning, known only to initiates. Another mystery of Latmos is the semicircular ledges located along the walls. These projections are of the same height and located at some distance from each other, as if they served as seats. However, they are too small for comfortable sitting, and their placement is contrary to common practice. Perhaps these projections served to place ritual objects or vessels, but no traces of these objects were found. Apparently, the complex was thoroughly cleaned before its final abandonment. In some areas of the caves, strange depressions resembling bowls were discovered on the floor. These indentations are perfectly round and too smooth to be natural. Perhaps they collected water that flowed down the walls during the rainy seasons. Water may have played an important role in rituals. But then why are such bowls located in places where water rarely flows? It is possible that the bowls served symbolic purposes associated with water rather than its actual use. Of particular interest are the so-called whispering chambers. Small rooms where the sound is amplified so much that even quiet breathing becomes an echo. When several people are in such a chamber at the same time, their voices merge into a single vibration. This creates the feeling that the space is alive, reacting to human presence. Perhaps it was these effects that ancient people used to create a feeling of contact with the world of spirits. Some researchers believe that Latmos was not only a place of ritual, but also a center of learning. Narrow passages interspersed with spacious halls may have been part of the initiation path. Walking through dark corridors, people faced their fears. Entering the illuminated halls, they felt relief and delight. This path could symbolize the transition from the material world to the spiritual. However, if Latmos was such an important center, why is there no written evidence about it? Perhaps knowledge was transmitted orally and was accessible only to a select few. Or perhaps Latmos was a place outside the normal cultural structure, a place of secret meetings attended by representatives of different nations. Then the absence of material traces becomes clear. People did not bring household items here, limiting themselves to what was necessary for the ritual. Local legends tell of the deep voices of Latmos, sounds that can be heard in the caves at night. People believed that these were the voices of ancestors living in stone. Sometimes, as they say, travelers who spent the night in Latmos returned changed, more calm and focused, or, conversely, anxious and silent. These legends emphasize the connection between caves and their psychological effects on humans. Perhaps ancient people were aware of these properties and created spaces aimed at promoting inner transformation. Geologists note that the Latmos caves were partly formed naturally, but many elements are clearly artificial. This combination of natural and human labor gives the impression that craftsmen used natural forms as a basis and then brought them to perfection. But why did they refuse to create similar complexes in other places? Perhaps Latmos was a unique place for them, a place of power associated with legends or ancient geological features. The cave complexes of Latmos remain one of the most mysterious places of the ancient world. They are filled with silence, but this silence seems to speak. The stone here stores not only the handprints of the masters, but also the breath of those who came here in the hope of hearing answers to life's questions. And today, when researchers stand in the center of one of the halls and listen to the sound fade into the depths, they experience the same sense of mystery as the ancients. Underground corridors of Nimrud. Beneath the ancient ruins of Nimrud, where stone platforms have long since lost their bas-reliefs, and the wind carries the dust of those who lived here thousands of years ago across the scorched earth, lies a network of underground corridors that archaeologists call one of the region's darkest secrets. Discovered by chance during excavations, these corridors do not look like ordinary storerooms or catacombs. They extend to unknown depths, giving the impression that beneath Nimrud there was a secret world, intended not for everyday life, but for activities hidden from view. The first thing that struck the researchers was the structure of the corridors. They are carved into dense rock, with smooth walls that appear to have been drawn with a ruler. The width of the corridors is almost the same, and the height allows a person to walk without bending over. But in some areas, the corridors narrow sharply, turning into a narrow passage that can only be passed sideways. Why are there such narrow spaces in the underground network? Perhaps they served as a kind of gate, symbolizing transitions between ritual levels. Or perhaps these areas were part of a defensive system designed to restrict movement along the corridors. Of particular interest are the round rooms into which the corridors lead. These halls have perfectly flat floors and domed ceilings, which create a powerful resonance. When a person speaks in such a hall, the sound resonates with extraordinary depth, as if the space itself is catching the voice. This suggests that the halls were used for rituals related to sound. Perhaps the priests uttered words that were supposed to be amplified by the stone, creating the effect of invisible force. Some researchers believe that such acoustic phenomena could cause an altered state of consciousness in participants. On the walls of some corridors, barely noticeable grooves were found, running parallel in large areas. These grooves could be traces of tools, but they are too smooth, as if they were drawn across the stone in one motion. Given the hardness of the rock, it is unclear what could have formed such lines. Perhaps the craftsmen used a special leveling technique based on the gradual removal of thin layers of stone. However, such a technique requires a huge amount of time and knowledge of the properties of the rock, which indicates a high level of skill of the builders. Interestingly, in some places in the corridors, there are small, perfectly rectangular depressions in the floor. These recesses are too shallow to serve as a container for objects. Most likely, they served as supports for wooden structures that have long disappeared. But if there were wooden elements inside the corridors, why are there no traces of them? It is possible that the wood was only used temporarily during construction and then removed. Or perhaps the grooves had a symbolic meaning associated with ritual actions. A particularly mysterious section of the corridors is one where the walls are covered with strange markings that resemble handprints. These marks are barely visible, but their location is not accidental. They are at shoulder level and form a long line on both sides of the corridor. Perhaps people touched the walls in certain places as they passed by. This could be part of a ritual, touching as a sign of respect or entry into a sacred place. But why are the marks so thin, as if they were made not with paint, but with pressure? Some researchers believe that the stone in these places was slightly softened, perhaps by moisture or special substances. However, such substances have not been found in this region. A strange phenomenon was discovered in one of the halls. When a person stands exactly in the center, his steps do not create an echo. In other places, the sound is reflected, but in the center, it disappears. This puzzled even acousticians, who tried to explain the effect by the features of the dome. But their calculations do not correspond to reality. It appears that the hall was designed with precise acoustic features beyond the capabilities of modern methods, or perhaps the effect was an accident and was exploited by ancient priests. Some corridors lead to dead ends, small stone rooms with perfectly smooth walls. There are no objects in these rooms, no traces of human presence, no symbols. Perhaps they served as places of solitude where people went to think. Or perhaps they were waiting rooms where ritual participants waited before entering the central halls. But the absence of any traces makes these rooms look like empty stone slabs, ready to absorb any meaning. However, not all sections of corridors are perfectly aligned. In some places, the walls are uneven, reminiscent of ancient destruction. But these destructions are not like the consequences of earthquakes. Rather, they resemble traces of a struggle with stone, as if people tried to widen the corridor, but then gave up their work. But why did they stop? Perhaps the layout of the complex changed, or the builders left without finishing what they started. Or, what is even more mysterious, the corridors were not built in one generation, but gradually, and their creation was interrupted by unknown events. One of the boldest hypotheses is that the corridors of Nimrud could serve as an underground map. Some researchers believe that the structure of the corridors mimics the alignment of the stars, with individual turns and chambers corresponding to specific constellations. This hypothesis is too difficult to confirm, but it has a certain symbolic appeal, as if the underworld mirrored the heavenly one. In this case, walking along the corridors could be a ritual symbolizing a journey through the worlds. Another mystery is why the corridors were so carefully hidden. Their entrances are disguised and some are blocked with stones. Perhaps the ancients deliberately closed access to the underworld, fearing that the knowledge hidden there could be used for other purposes. Or perhaps it was a rite of passage, the final act of the people leaving Nimrud. But no written evidence of such a decision has been found. Today, the underground corridors of Nimrud are illuminated by electric light, but even so, they keep their dark secret. As the explorer walks through them, footsteps echo in the void, and the air seems still. In such places, you realize how little we know about the ancient masters. Their mastery of stone, their sense of space and light, their mastery of sound, all created structures that continue to inspire respect and awe. And it seems that the corridors of Nimrud do not so much hide the secret as they themselves are part of it. They are the embodiment of an ancient plan frozen in stone. All we can do is move forward, listen to the silence, and hope that one day we will understand why this underground world was created. Under the cover of centuries, these secrets continue to live their lives, preserving the silence of ancient worlds and traces of lost knowledge. Each of them is just a fragment of a huge picture that we cannot yet see in its entirety.